What are you doing in here? Leonardo Moretti's ice-cold voice cut through the soft lullaby. Isabella startled, her arms instinctively tightening around the warm bundle on her chest. Inside, baby Sophia had finally drifted off to sleep after hours of wailing, her steady breathing the only sound of peace in the cold, high-tech room. He stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette in a perfect suit, holding not a toy, but a phone, glowing with charts and data. His eyes weren't on his daughter's sleeping face, but fixed on the thing Isabella was using to hold her. "What is that thing?" he demanded, his tone pure scrutiny. "It's a faja, sir," Isabella answered softly. "It helps her feel secure." That security was something his array of expensive sensors and apps had failed to provide. But to Leonardo, this fabric sling was an error, a variable not in his programming. It was chaos in the perfect order he had imposed on his daughter's life. "My protocol doesn't include this," he said flatly, striding toward her, each step radiating authority. "I hired you to follow the schedule, not to bring outdated customs into my home." He pointed to the smart crib in the corner. "Put her in there. The schedule requires her to sleep alone to foster independence." Isabella looked down at Sophia's angelic face, her tiny chest rising and falling in time with her own heartbeat. Then she looked back up at the man before her. He could read 1,000 lines of data on a screen, but was completely blind to the simple message his daughter was desperate to convey. Leonardo Moretti, a genius of technology, couldn't understand the most fundamental language on earth, the language of affection. Isabella gently placed Sophia in the smart crib. The moment the baby's back touched the mattress, a piercing cry rose up, drowning out the soulless classical music the machine automatically began to play. Her heart sank. Mrs. Elvira, the Moretti family's longtime housekeeper, entered, her expression etched with concern. "Miss Cruz, the master insists on absolute adherence to the schedule." "The schedule is hurting her," Isabella replied, a note of desperation in her voice. "Listen to that, it's not a normal cry. She needs to be held." Mrs. Elvira's gaze fell on the neatly folded faja on the table. "I understand, child, but this is the Moretti castle, where the rules are harder than stone." Isabella clutched the fabric, the only piece of heritage she had brought with her from her laughter-filled home in Andalusia. "At home, this is all it would take to soothe my little brothers and sisters," she said quietly, her voice full of longing. "My grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me. It's all I've ever known." She had put her dream of studying art in a university lecture hall on hold to be here. This salary was the only hope for her mother's chemotherapy and for her brother, Matteo, to go to school. She couldn't afford to lose this job. "Then learn what the master wants," Mrs. Elvira advised, her voice softening. "Don't fight him." The housekeeper left, leaving Isabella alone with Sophia's heart-wrenching cries and her own inner conflict. She looked at the poor child struggling in the cold crib, then back at the faja in her hands. On one side was the job she desperately needed, on the other, the one thing she knew with certainty was right. And tonight, it seemed she couldn't have both. Heeding Mrs. Elvira's advice, Isabella tried to push her instincts aside. She told herself she had to trust Leonardo's system. The next morning, she picked up the tablet, determined to follow every last detail. The tablet became her true master, but a machine cannot soothe a child. Every feeding became a tear-soaked battle. Every scheduled brain stimulation activity was met with desperate wails. Day after day, the lavish castle echoed with Sophia's cries, a persistent, painful sound. The baby wasn't improving. She was visibly withering away. Isabella's patience wore thin. During an end-of-day report, she couldn't take it anymore. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice urgent. "She refuses to eat and barely sleeps. This schedule is draining her." Leonardo, his eyes still glued to the charts on his phone, replied robotically. "The data shows her caloric intake is still within the acceptable range. Continue with the protocol." "But those are just numbers," Isabella blurted out. "Can't you see she's fading?" This time, Leonardo looked up. His gaze was glacial. "I hired you to execute, not to feel. If you can't do that, you will be replaced." The threat stunned Isabella, but it didn't scare her. It ignited a quiet resolve. She couldn't let a helpless child continue to suffer because of a stubborn father who trusted only in machines. She had to do something, even if it cost her everything. The next afternoon, as soon as Leonardo's car disappeared beyond the main gate, Isabella whispered to the stirring baby in the crib. "No more listening to machines, Sophia," she said softly. "It's time to listen to our hearts." She ignored the flashing tablet. Instead, she took the faja from the closet. As she skillfully wrapped Sophia to her chest, she felt the baby's tiny body relax. The whimper that had been about to start died before it began. Isabella opened the door and stepped out onto the vast terrace. A honey-colored sunset was stretching over the vineyards. "You see, little one," Isabella pointed out into the distance, "this is the real world, not black and white cards." She played a soft flamenco guitar melody from her phone. A warm breeze carried the scent of earth and grape leaves. "My grandmother used to say there's no music sweeter than the wind singing through the leaves," she murmured, swaying gently as she hummed a Spanish lullaby. And then, a miracle happened. Sophia, the baby who had never smiled, suddenly curved her lips. A real smile, bright and pure, blossomed on her face. "Oh my God, you're smiling," Isabella whispered, her heart overflowing with joy. "You're smiling, my little angel." Just then, the housekeeper, Mrs. Elvira, stepped out, holding a tea tray. She froze when she saw the scene before her. "Miss Cruz, the child," she stammered, in utter disbelief. "Yes," Isabella turned, beaming. "She's smiling, Mrs. Elvira." Mrs. Elvira set the tray down and walked closer, her eyes wide with astonishment and emotion. She looked at the child resting peacefully against Isabella's chest, then at the young Nanny. She simply gave a slow nod, a silent approval that needed no words. That night, Sophia slept deeply and peacefully on Isabella's chest. For the first time, the Moretti castle fell into a peaceful silence, the kind that no technology could ever create. Leonardo Moretti did not trust what he saw on his phone. Sophia's health metrics, after weeks of red warning indicators, had suddenly turned green. She was eating more, sleeping deeper, but when he opened the security camera feed, he didn't see his daughter following the schedule. He saw Isabella holding her in that colorful fabric sling out on the terrace, and then he saw it a smile. That smile didn't exist in any of his algorithms. To Leonardo, it wasn't a miracle. It was a glitch in the system, an unexplainable outcome. He came home that evening and went straight to the nursery. Isabella was humming softly, rocking a sleeping Sophia on her shoulder. "Today's reports were different," he said, his cold voice shattering the peace. Isabella turned, her face hopeful. "Yes, sir. Sophia is doing so much better." "I saw the camera," he interrupted, his gaze probing. "What did you do?" I just held her," Isabella tried to explain. "She needs warmth, connection." "Connection is not a measurable piece of data," Leonardo dismissed. "I don't pay you for vague concepts. I want a detailed report." He pointed to an empty desk. "Log everything you do that isn't in the app, every action, every song, every minute. I want to know exactly what your formula is. Submit it to me by morning." He turned and left, leaving Isabella speechless. He hadn't asked how she had comforted his daughter. He wanted her to write an instruction manual for affection. Isabella never wrote a single line of the report. She couldn't analyze a smile or quantify a hug. Instead, she continued to do what her heart told her was right. A few days later, a meeting in Florence was cancelled at the last minute, and Leonardo decided to head home early. As his sports car turned onto the gravel road that wound through his family's vineyards, he saw them from a distance. Under the brilliant gold of a Tuscan sunset, Isabella was strolling peacefully between the rows of vines. His daughter, Sophia, wasn't in her high-tech stroller, but was nestled securely against Isabella's chest in that colorful fabric. Sophia wasn't crying. She was looking up at the young green grapes, her tiny hands reaching out as if to touch them. The scene was so peaceful, so natural, and it sent Leonardo into a rage. He slammed on the brakes, the crunch of gravel under the tires shattering the silence. He stormed out of the car, his expensive suit looking utterly out of place in the rustic setting. "Is this your report, Miss Cruz?" he roared, his voice thick with fury. Isabella spun around, instinctively clutching Sophia tighter. "Sir, you were just ignoring every rule I set." He cut her off, striding toward her with fire in his eyes. "I demanded a report, not an outdoor cultural performance. These are my vineyards, not a stage for your ancient experiments." "This isn't an experiment," Isabella replied, her voice trembling but firm. "This is how my mother and my grandmother raised us. She likes the air out here. I don't care what she likes," Leonardo snarled, his anger making him lose all control. "I care about protocol, about science, about the image of this family. What are you turning my daughter into? A showpiece for your backward customs?" He pointed at the faja as if it was something filthy. "Get that thing off of her, now." Without waiting for Isabella to reply, he lunged forward and roughly untied the knots of the faja. His hold was clumsy and rigid, a stark contrast to Isabella's gentle touch. The moment she was ripped from that familiar warmth and security, a heart-wrenching scream erupted. Sophia didn't just cry. She shrieked, thrashing in her father's arms as if being tortured, her small eyes desperately searching for Isabella. She didn't want him. She wanted the arms that had comforted her. "Get her out of here," Leonardo commanded his stunned driver, his voice devoid of any regret. His eyes were fixed on the hysterical child in his arms. Isabella only had time for one last look at Sophia, tears streaming down her face. She said nothing. No words could possibly capture her pain. After Isabella was gone, the Moretti castle reverted to its true nature, a luxurious tomb. Leonardo tried everything. He placed the baby in her crib, activating the app's emergency soothing mode. But the Mozart, the white noise, the projected images on the ceiling, they were all useless, completely drowned out by Sophia's incessant shrieking. The following days were even worse. Sophia regressed completely, falling into a state of despair even deeper than before. She refused to eat, lost weight rapidly, and her sleep was nothing more than short, exhausted jolts. That night, walking through the pitch-black hallway, Leonardo heard his daughter's choked sobs echoing from the nursery. For the first time, he didn't feel annoyed. He felt a chilling emptiness. The castle was the same, the technology worked perfectly, but something was gone. It was cold, soulless. He realized then that Isabella hadn't just taken the fabric sling. She had taken the very soul of the house with her. By the third night, the silence between Sophia's cries had become heavier than ever. Leonardo sat alone in the lavish living room, his phone with its useless charts cast aside. He was exhausted. His technology, his pride, had failed. In his desperation, his mind raced, searching for a variable, some detail his logic had missed. And the only image that surfaced in his tired mind was the sight of Sophia, peaceful in Isabella's cloth sling. He didn't search for faja. He typed a simple, desperate phrase into the search bar: how to get a baby to stop crying. He scrolled past hundreds of useless tips. Then he saw an article titled, "The Ancient Wisdom of Baby Wearing." He clicked. A flood of images appeared. Modern fathers and mothers all over the world. New York, Tokyo, Berlin, carrying their babies in slings, nearly identical to Isabella's. They weren't conducting ancient cultural experiments. They were simply holding their children. He read about skin-to-skin contact, about the security a child feels hearing a parent's heartbeat. There were no complex charts, no advanced algorithms, just simple truths about human instinct. This wasn't rocket science. It was common sense. And he had dismissed that common sense as something backward. A bitter wave of shame washed over him. That feeling propelled him into the one room he always avoided, his late wife's study. He wasn't looking for anything specific. Maybe he just wanted to feel a trace of her warmth. He sat in her chair and opened a random drawer. Inside was her journal. He flipped to a page near the end, her familiar handwriting catching his eye. "I saw a mother wearing her baby on the street today. They looked so peaceful. I hope our daughter gets to know the feeling of being held in her father's arms. I want her to know her parents' heartbeats before she has to learn about algorithms." The journal slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. It wasn't a criticism. It was a prayer. A prayer he had cruelly ignored. Sitting there, in a room full of memories, with his daughter's cries echoing in his ears, the fortress of pride Leonardo Moretti had built around himself completely crumbled. He buried his head in his hands, and for the first time since his wife's death, he wept. The next morning, Leonardo didn't call his lawyer or his HR department. He drove himself. The expensive sports car looked completely out of place as it turned onto the narrow roads of Isabella's village, a world away from the luxury of Tuscany. There were no castles, only warm, plaster-walled homes with clotheslines dancing in the breeze. He asked a few locals for directions and finally found her. Not in a fancy apartment, but in a small, humble cafe where the smell of roasted coffee and pastries mingled in the air. Through the glass window, he saw her. This wasn't the timid nanny from his castle. Here, she was the center of her own small universe. She was patiently explaining a math problem to her younger brother, then turning to feed a bite of cake to her mother, who looked tired, but whose eyes shone with pride. She was smiling a natural, unforced smile. He realized this was the real Isabella, a person born to love and to care. Leonardo took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The chime above the door rang, causing the small cafe to fall silent. All eyes turned to the stranger in the perfect Italian suit. Isabella froze, the smile vanishing from her lips, replaced by a wary guardedness. Her brother sat up straighter, and her mother placed a protective hand on her arm. Leonardo didn't walk directly to their table. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. "Miss Cruz." "Isabella," he began, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its authority. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, Isabella saw the vulnerability in the arrogant man's gaze. "I was wrong," he said, two simple words heavy with regret. "I was an arrogant fool, a terrible father." He glanced at her mother and brother. "And I was incredibly unfair to you." Isabella said nothing, just watched him silently. "Sophia. She needs you." His voice cracked. "She doesn't need my apps. She needs you. I was too blind to see it." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to an earnest plea. "Please, come back. Not as an employee following my stupid rules. Come back and teach me. Teach me how to be a father. Teach me what you've known all along. I'm begging you." The entire cafe held its breath. The plea of the wine magnate Leonardo Moretti wasn't echoing in a boardroom, but in a humble cafe, in front of the woman he had treated so cruelly. His redemption had truly begun. Isabella looked at Leonardo, then turned to her mother and brother. Her mother gently squeezed her hand, a silent warning. She didn't trust this rich man. Isabella took a breath, gathering her courage. When she turned back to face Leonardo, her eyes were no longer those of a timid nanny. They were calm, steady, and resolute. "I'll come back," she said, her voice clear, "for Sophia, but not on the same terms." Leonardo nodded eagerly, ready to agree to anything. "Anything, not anything," she corrected. "3 things. These are my conditions." She held up a finger. "First, not me, but you. You will learn to use the faja. Sophia needs to feel her father's heartbeat, not just her nanny's. I will teach you, and you will wear her yourself, every single day." Leonardo hesitated for a second at the demand to personally embrace the very thing he had scorned. But then he gave a decisive nod. "Okay, I'll learn." "Second," she continued, her gaze shifting to her mother, who was watching him without blinking. "When you fired me, you didn't just insult me, you insulted my family." My mother lost sleep with worry. She looked directly at Leonardo. "You will apologize to my mother, right here, right now." For a man as proud as Leonardo, this was an even greater challenge. But he didn't hesitate. He turned, faced the older woman with the stern eyes, and bowed his head, a gesture of sincere respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet, "I apologize. My arrogance caused your daughter pain. I am deeply sorry." Isabella's mother said nothing, but the tension in her face eased slightly. And finally, Isabella said, her voice firming up, "Most importantly, Sophia is Italian, but she will also grow up with my Spanish heritage. You must promise to respect that. My lullabies, my language, my values. They will no longer be unauthorized in your house. They will be a part of Sophia's life." She looked him straight in the eye, waiting. This wasn't a demand about a job. It was a demand for recognition, for dignity. Leonardo looked at her, the young woman who had taught him a lesson no data chart ever could. "I promise," he said, his voice solid. "I promise." Leonardo's change wasn't an empty promise. It began that very afternoon, clumsily and authentically. In the living room of the Moretti castle, Isabella stood opposite him, holding the faja. "All right, put your hand through here," she instructed. "No, not like that. You need to wrap it tighter. She needs to feel secure, not loose." Leonardo, the man who could run a multi-million-dollar wine empire, fumbled with a piece of cloth. He frowned, struggling with the knots, feeling more helpless than ever. I can't do it. I'm afraid I'll drop her. You can, Isabella said, her voice patient. Breathe. Feel her. Don't think like an engineer. Feel like a father. Finally, with her help, he managed. Sophia was placed in the sling, her tiny chest pressed against his. The baby stirred a little, then looked up at her father with wide eyes, and then, instead of crying, she let out a long, contented sigh and nestled her head against his chest, falling asleep. For the first time, Leonardo truly felt the warm weight of his daughter. He heard the steady rhythm of her breathing, felt his own heartbeat drumming beneath her tiny body. No app, no chart could ever describe this feeling. It was a primal, powerful, and real connection. He stood stone still, afraid that the slightest movement might shatter this precious moment. One afternoon, while Isabella was playing with Sophia on the rug, her phone rang. It was the hospital where her mother was being treated. Her heart sank, fearing bad news. But the voice on the other end was cheerful. "Miss Cruz, I'm calling with wonderful news. The entire cost for your mother's advanced chemotherapy treatment has been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor." Isabella was stunned. A benefactor? But who? "I'm sorry, we're not authorized to disclose that. They only asked that we ensure your mother receives the very best care," the nurse replied. A few days later, a thick envelope from the most prestigious engineering university in Italy arrived for her brother, Matteo. He called her, his voice trembling with excitement. Not only had he been accepted, but he had also been awarded a full scholarship covering all living expenses, sponsored by a private education fund. That night, after Sophia was fast asleep, Isabella found Leonardo in the library. He was reading a book, but she knew he wasn't focused. "The hospital called," she said softly, "and Matteo's university sent a letter." Leonardo didn't look up, just turned a page. "Is that so? Good news, I hope." "It was you, wasn't it?" she asked directly, her voice choked with emotion. He was silent for a long moment before closing the book and finally looking at her. He didn't admit it, but his eyes said it all. Tears began to stream down Isabella's cheeks. "I told you not to use money to." "This isn't about money," he interrupted, his voice low and sincere. "It's restitution, and it's an investment." She looked at him, confused. "You can't care for Sophia properly when your heart is heavy with worry for your own family," he explained. "Your mother deserves to be well, your brother deserves a future, and you deserve peace of mind." He stood and walked closer, closing the invisible distance between them for the first time. "I was wrong to disrespect your family, Isabella. I understand now that your strength comes from them." In that moment, Isabella realized their bond had grown far beyond the child they both loved. It was forged in a deep understanding, respect, and the quiet effort to heal wounds by a man who had finally learned how to truly love. The Moretti castle was no longer a sterile laboratory. It had become a home. The evening sun no longer just glinted off expensive technology. It streamed into every corner of rooms now filled with Sophia's laughter. In the evenings, you no longer heard pre-programmed classical music. Instead, there was the rustic sound of Isabella's guitar, and sometimes Leonardo's clumsy Spanish singing as he tried to hum along to the lullabies. He had turned off all notifications, deleted every tracking app. The tablet that was once his Bible now gathered dust in a drawer. Leonardo, with a peaceful Sophia sleeping in the faja against his chest, would smile softly as he listened to the music. He was no longer searching for perfection in numbers and charts. He found it in the steady rhythm of his daughter's breath, in the warmth of the fabric that had taught him so much, and in a sense of peace he had never known. He finally understood that the most precious legacy he could give his daughter wasn't found in a complex algorithm, but in the simple, ancient wisdom of a human embrace.